Okay, so in terms of Jacksonian America, I need to first of all explain kind of what that is, and then just briefly look at it. Um, we mentioned Andrew Jackson's rise before, and his name is going to become a label for the entire sort of period in the 19th century, from the 1820s, really almost to the coming of the Civil War. We talk about this Jacksonian democracy or Jacksonian America, and like we literally use the label of Andrew Jackson to talk about it. Now remember, he came to fame initially in at the very end of the War of 1812, but it's going to take him a little bit more time to kind of, I guess, capitalize on that momentum, and his rise will coincide with the rise of the nation itself. But several things get in his way. He has a couple of obstacles to overcome. So in some ways, his story is kind of like the story of those folks moving west that you see, that also are going to have some obstacles to overcome and some conflicts and things to deal with. He does not win the first time. Right? He does not win the first time. In 1825, James Monroe is succeeded by John Quincy Adams as president. That name might sound a little familiar because John Quincy Adams was the son of John Adams, the second president. So you have the president's son being elected. Again, we're not too unfamiliar with that idea with the Bush family, for instance. In some ways, I think Jackson had to look at this and think, man, I'm an outsider. Right? He's going to look at himself as an outsider to politics, as we're going to see. And someone like a John Quincy Adams as being an insider, right? Being almost born into it, being kind of an old political family along the lines in the 20th century of the Kennedys or, again, the Bushes or Clintons or any number of folks that are going to have multiple folks vying for this type of power. Well, John Quincy Adams' opponent in the election of 1824 was Andrew Jackson. He runs for president in 1824. Now, he may have been optimistic on some level because he was the Battle of New Orleans, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. He has made a name for himself as a strong opponent of Native Americans. One of his nicknames is the Indian Killer. Specifically, he did not look too kindly upon Native peoples, but Jackson doesn't look too kindly on a lot of folks, as we'll discuss. He's one of these characters that seems more fictional than real in some ways, and I'll sort of mention some of the things about him. Well, some of the things about him are this that might be surprising. Jackson had killed some folks. Right? He's going to be a murderer. You wouldn't think as a murderer you could get elected president, but Jackson is going to do that. I'm not talking about just killing in the military. I'm talking about he killed a guy in a duel. Right? There was a whole thing with some guy insulting his wife. He busted a cap in and got one himself. He actually lived the rest of his life with a bullet himself. Going to be one of these larger than life Tupac figure, right? 50 Cent. He gets shot and keeps going. So in some way, maybe you can understand why folks are going to be fascinated with an Andrew Jackson, even though he's not the traditional politician. In some ways, he's going to fit this time period perfectly. So again, he was the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. That kind of starts his rise from his early life in Tennessee. Right? He's not even from Virginia or Massachusetts. He's not from one of these old traditional states in terms of political power. Tennessee is southern, but it's almost more the west, the frontier. It's less developed than some of these other areas. So Jackson is popular. He actually won a majority of the popular vote in 1824, but as we know, the popular vote does not determine who gets the White House. Right? So even though he has more popular votes than John Quincy Adams, he failed to win a majority in the Electoral College. So we know how the rules went. The House of Representatives, therefore, will decide the election of 1824. And who do they choose? They choose John Quincy Adams. Maybe because he's from an old political family. Maybe because Andrew Jackson is a little bit out there in the minds of most folks. But you can imagine how angry Andrew Jackson is going to be. Right? How angry is he going to be? So the House of Representatives decides the outcome, and they choose John Quincy Adams. At the same time, Adams' administration is going to be largely unsuccessful. Maybe he's behind the eight ball again because most people had voted for somebody else. Maybe he's beyond the eight ball because his father had been president, so he's always going to be compared to his father in a sense. And many people will consider him lacking, in comparison to his founding father, president father. So in many ways, we see Adams' administration as being unsuccessful. Congress and the new president don't get along, right? They're at odds over various things, including the tariff. The tariff is a tax on imports and exports. And the tariff is going to become an important conversation in this period because it's another one of these rules or laws that are going to be interpreted as either being in favor of the North or in favor of the South. Right? It's hard to do both, it seems. Both sides are already looking at each other as almost being separate imagined communities, I would argue. Right? So Congress and the president are disagreeing over the tariff and other issues. So he has his 4 years, John Quincy Adams does, but then 1828 comes, and who's there waiting? Andrew Jackson. Right? Andrew Jackson feels like he has learned something, right? And he's going to use what he's learned. This time he will defeat John Quincy Adams pretty handily. And for the next 8 years, Andrew Jackson will be president of the United States. His presidency is really kind of heralded as a new era in American politics. Right? We often refer to it as a period of Jacksonian democracy or the era of the common man, quote unquote. Right? Jacksonian democracy or the era of the common man. Remember, Jackson is not from an old political family. He's this relatively unknown that's going to rise up and become, the most powerful man in the nation. So think about how that seems like a very American story, right? You can come from anywhere and become president, is the narrative that we will have. So in some ways, I think he becomes a symbol of American democracy. So this notion of Jacksonian democracy is going to be a powerful idea, and still is, you can argue. It still is. Now, for one thing, Jackson himself will run as a representative of the common man. Right? He will fully embrace this notion of, what did Drake say? Started from the bottom, now I'm here. Right? I pull myself up by my bootstraps. I don't have to come from money. I can become whatever. It's the American dream. Right? I'm working hard. I can make myself great in one lifetime. He's going to run as a representative of the common man rather than as a representative of the establishment, rather than as a representative of the elites. Right? So if we put that in 2019 terms, right, he's going to say, I'm going to come to see and drain the swamp. Right? I'm going to get rid of these traditional politics and all the problems because I'm not a traditional politician. I'm going to do things differently. Does that sound familiar? Of course it does, right? We hear a lot of that recently, and a lot of Americans are drawn to that idea. So you can understand perhaps why he might be so popular and why so many might look at him as their personal hero. In addition, Jackson comes at the right time. Timing is important. He's coming during a kind of tipping point in politics in American history. What do I mean? Well, Jackson will take advantage of the fact, right? He'll take advantage of the fact that by the 1820s, almost all states had eliminated the remaining property qualifications for voting. So before, you had to own a certain level of property to vote. What that meant was that you had to essentially be elite, right? The poor wouldn't necessarily have the right to vote. Now, because of this kind of movement towards expanding the democracy, right, this idea that all men are created equal, right, this idea that you shouldn't be limited in your voting based on your class, states start to get rid of those property qualifications. So by 1820, pretty much all the states had gotten rid of that. Right? So we're going to get a term that I want to unpack a little bit. The term is universal white male suffrage. Universal white male suffrage. If you ever see this term suffrage, what does that mean? Let me ask you first. What does that term suffrage mean? Have you heard that term before? To vote, right? The right of suffrage or female suffrage, women's suffrage, right? That's the right to vote. So if we're unpacking this phrase, suffrage, universal white male suffrage, we can take it piece by piece. What does universal mean? Everyone can vote. So if it just said universal suffrage, that would mean that everyone in the country has the right to vote. But that's not what it says. Right? So I want to unpack this term and its complications because, on one level, in this period of the history of the U.S., you are getting an expansion of democracy to include more people than ever before. Right? You are getting an expansion of democracy, meaning more people can participate in the political process. Right? But there are some limitations on that. Right? There are some limitations on that. Because if it was everybody could vote, it'd be universal suffrage, but that's not what it says. Right? There are some qualifiers on there. Universal white male suffrage. That means basically all white males can vote. So how can this be possible? How can it be possible that you're expanding democracy, but obviously you're also limiting democracy because who's not included in this? Women. Half the population can't vote. And who else is not included in this? People of color. So does this make sense that you can get an expansion of democracy, but also have a limited access to that democracy? Does that make sense? I think this concept is a good way to to label it. So to put it in mathematical terms, I'm going to make up some numbers. Let's say in 1800, 10% of the population could vote because of age, race, gender restrictions, because of class restrictions. You had to own a certain level of property. Right? Say 10% of the population can vote in 1800, just to make up a number. By the 1820s, that number has increased. Right? So by the 1820s, let's say 40% of the population can vote. That is an increase then from 1800 to 1820. Right? So you go from 10 to 40%. That is an expansion of democracy, which most would argue is a good thing. Yet, that does not mean that everybody can vote, or that does not mean that the majority can vote, because women are not included in that. They're half the population, right? People of color. So this is why I think it's an interesting time period and why this label is useful for us, right? We can use this to talk about both the expansion of democracy based on what it was, but also the fact that it does not include everyone. There are still limitations on it, especially based on race and gender. If not class, race, and gender are still very important. So Jackson is going to be coming up at the right time because since so many more working class white men can vote, they look at Jackson as their hero. Why? Because he comes from them. He's going to be propelled perhaps to the White House because of the time change. Maybe he couldn't have been elected 50 years earlier, 40 years earlier. Right? But now he can be. Right? Things have changed. So he will run as a representative of the common man. He and his campaign folks understood this perhaps better than most. And he's going to run as a representative of the common man. He will take advantage of the fact that by the 1820s, the rules had mostly changed. Almost all states had eliminated the property qualifications so that pretty much all white males could vote. Right? Universal white male suffrage. Jackson and his supporters will use new techniques. Right? They didn't have television ads back then, but they are going to have certain techniques for campaigning, and many of these will be newer. He will have mass rallies and parades, picnics. How do you get somebody's attention? Give them some food. What do we do here at school when we have, let's say, a speaker coming to campus, but let's say the speaker's on a Friday at 4 o'clock. Oh, man, nobody's going to come. Or they're going to leave, right? It's in the afternoon. What do? Free pizza. Why? Because most students, we remember, are usually hungry. If we can get you in the room for some free pizza, maybe you'll stay and actually hear the speaker. That might be helpful. Right? So this is a way of getting you there. No? Burgers? Pizza? Barbecue? Well, there's a few things I might stay for. I mean, I might go to, okay, I shouldn't say this. You might catch me at a Klan meeting. They got some good barbecue. Okay. Maybe not. But you get the point, right? You might be some places you might not normally be if there's a good incentive, a good reason to be there. Even if it's a good speaker, it doesn't matter if you're not there, right? It doesn't matter if we pay a bunch of money for a speaker and nobody shows up. In fact, that's a waste. So he's going to have picnics and rallies and barbecues, and common people will come out. What do you remember? I don't remember what his position on the issues is, but I remember he gave us some food. Right? I like him. Let's vote Jackson. So you get some of that as well. In addition, there's going to be a technique called mudslinging. Mudslinging. What does mudslinging mean in politics? What does that mean? What do you think? I'll tell you. Yeah, basically. Right? In order to make yourself look better, you make your opponent look worse. Right? So imagine like two people wearing white suits and you're slinging mud. Right? You're going to dirty them up and so you look better. I think this is going to be doubly useful for Andrew Jackson because Andrew Jackson was a scary guy. Right? Jackson had busted shots in people before, so you wanted to be real careful about the smack you talked to him. Right? He shot the guy that insulted his wife, killed him. So I think you probably said a little bit, but you're like, ooh, not across the line. This guy might literally kill me. Right? So I think the mudslinging thing. There probably were a lot of folks that were afraid to sling back. But this becomes a pretty important political strategy. Still is, right? Still is. Think about the TV ads you see during the election season. Usually they're about the opponent, not about what you stand for. They're about how bad the opponent is. And so folks often will vote for you because the other option seems so bad. So he's going to use these new, more modern strategies to his advantage. Some say that Andrew Jackson is the nation's first truly strong president. The first truly strong president. Now that always struck me as odd because I always thought of George Washington as being an extremely strong president. And in many ways he is. Remember, he has universal, he's accepted universally, essentially. But remember, Washington doesn't really use his power, right? He walks away from power after 2 terms. He doesn't use it as much as he could have. Jackson is going to be a bit of the opposite. Jackson is going to push for a stronger presidency. And he's going to push for a stronger presidency. He dominated Congress. He would dominate Congress. And many considered him tyrannical. They thought he was a tyrant. They thought he was authoritarian. One of his nicknames is going to be King Andrew. Because people are like, oh, he thinks he's king. They didn't call it that to his face, but they called him that behind his back, this notion of King Andrew. There are going to be a number of presidents that will use different tactics and strategies, and some will be seen as more stronger than others, let's say. Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, right, he was from Texas. He was a bigger guy, and Lyndon Johnson was known to catch a congressman in the bathroom. When they're voting on something, he voted against Lyndon Johnson, he would catch you in the bathroom and kind of have a conversation with you, right? So reporters would talk about a congressman coming out of the bathroom looking like sweating and looking all nervous, and suddenly he's changed his vote, right? Lyndon Johnson comes out like, eh. So some of these presidents, would use various strategies and twist arms and do various things. Andrew Jackson was definitely one of those. Andrew Jackson was definitely one of those. And he has a scary reputation. Part of the video that you hadn't seen yet, I don't think, is Andrew Jackson almost shoots Daniel Boone. Daniel Boone's threatening to go home. Jackson pulls out on him. He's like, "You're not going anywhere." Right? He was notorious for getting his way, let's say. So think about these, how Congress might back down to someone like that. So how does he operate as president? He will defend something called the spoils system. He will defend the spoils system. What is the spoils system? Well, you heard the phrase ever, to the victors go the spoils. To the victors go the spoils. The idea is, like in war, if your army, sacks a town, right, and defeats the forces that are defending that town, the army then comes in and takes the food and sometimes does horrible things, right? But they win, right? So to the victors go the spoils of war. Well, the spoils system is kind of a translation of that a bit. It was basically the practice of rewarding your political supporters with government jobs. So you're running, let's say you're running an election, and your best buddy from high school is your campaign manager, or your college roommate is your secretary, whatever. Right? They help you win. They would expect to get rewarded with posts, government posts, right? Now, this makes sense in some level because you want people around you that are going to be loyal. And Jackson wanted people around him that were going to be loyal. Now, some are going to start to question this practice of the spoils system, though, because they'll argue that it doesn't mean that the best person for the job is getting the job, right? What if I run for president, right? That's a scary thought. But what if I run for president? And let's say my best friend from high school is my campaign manager, right? I win. You're like, yeah, right. But I win. And then I'm like, hey, okay, you're Secretary of the Treasury. My buddy Joe, let's say, right? Joe, you're Secretary of the Treasury. He's like, man, I don't, you sure? I'm like, yes, I want you. I'm President, you're Secretary of the Treasury. He's like, okay. He's like, but Sekani, I can't count, right? I don't worry about that. Don't worry about that. I said, right? Now, is that good for the nation? Right? For Joe to be setting up the budget when Joe can't count? No, not necessarily. So some are going to start to question this, but Jackson and others believe that it was more important to have somebody loyal than to have like the perfect person in position. And so there are many positions that are appointed, right? That when you win, you sweep out the old people and sweep in the new people. There are still a lot of positions that are that way. Right? There are still some government posts that have never been filled since the last election because the old person is kind of kicked out. So is this a good thing? Is it a bad thing? Well, it depends. It depends on your perspective. Later, we'll see some attempts to change this process. But Jackson will reward his political supporters in this way as others had before him. He also understood how to exploit some of the tensions that are developing between North and South, right? These sectional tensions are going to be things he's going to exploit and use to his advantage as president. He knows that if he can kind of pit North and South against each other, then it only strengthens him in the executive office. So even though technically Jackson is from the South, often he's going to do things that anger the South. He was most interested in the power of the presidency, and anything that threatened his power was something he wanted to destroy. So we'll see this again in terms of things like slavery and states' rights, and the South thinking that they got a Southerner in office and they'll be okay, often are surprised at some of the things he will do. So for Jackson's presidency, you're going to get three big issues, right? Three big issues will dominate it. Right? Three major issues, at least, that we will sort of summarize briefly here. First, Andrew Jackson will speed up the process of Indian removal. Now, we've already talked about how Native Americans are being seen more and more as a problem, as an obstacle to progress for the nation. And so some will say that they either need to be destroyed or removed. Some will say that they can be assimilated, right, made into Americans, but many will say no, they can't be. They're different, they're racially different, religiously, whatever. They either have to be removed or destroyed. And this notion of removal or destruction is something that Jackson was very much in favor of. Again, one of his nicknames was the Indian Killer, the Indian fighter, Indian Killer. He had done a lot of fighting of natives in Florida and other places. Jackson would actually ignore a Supreme Court decision that would have protected the Cherokee. What happened is the Cherokee sued the state of Georgia. They sued that they should not be removed. And the Supreme Court's like, they're right. In 1831, 1832, the Supreme Court rules in the favor of the Cherokee Nation. But Jackson is like, I don't care what the Supreme Court says. His quote was, what the Supreme Court justice has made his decision, now let him enforce it. Basically, he's like, I don't care what you say, they're going to be removed. So this notion of Indian removal is a big deal under Jackson's administration, number one. Second, North and South will become even more divided over the issue of the tariff that we raised last time. Remember the tariff and this idea of taxes, the level of taxes on imports and exports. Right? If you're producing raw materials like cotton, you may want a low tariff, let's say, or a high tariff. I forget which way it goes. But if you're a merchant, you want a certain level tariff. And if you're a farmer, you want a different level tariff. So that, again, could break down into North and South. So this issue of the tariff can be seen as a sectional issue in this period. Now, although technically Andrew Jackson is not really sympathetic to the tariff, he believed that a strong federal government was most important. A strong presidency was most important. So he said the federal government had the authority to impose tariffs on the states, even if the states didn't want it, even if the states felt like it was hurting them. So some of the southern states are like, you're imposing these tariffs. These are not good for us as a region. Jackson's like, doesn't matter. I'm president. So South Carolina, for instance, is going to have some real issues with Andrew Jackson. In fact, South Carolina and some others will come up with a policy called nullification. Nullification. They're going to argue that these powers are unconstitutional, and that if there's a law passed that hurts the state or hurts the region, they should have the right to nullify it. They should have the right to ignore or nullify it. This is going to come up around the tariff. Do they have the right to nullify the tariff or not if they feel like it hurts their economy, if they feel like it hurts them as a region? They believe they do. Andrew Jackson believes they do not. So this becomes an issue in both 1828 and 1832. Andrew Jackson will threaten to send in the army to invade South Carolina because South Carolina is saying they're going to nullify the tariff rules. So we might have a civil war in 1828, basically. Now, to their credit, South Carolina knows Andrew Jackson is not playing around, and so they would back down from this. But some argue that the Civil War could have started earlier, right, if you had federal troops invading South Carolina to impose these laws that they felt they could nullify. So again, Jackson opposes the theory of nullification because he felt it undermined the power of the federal government. He felt it undermined his power as president, that no state should have a right to oppose the federal government. Think about this balance between state governments and federal governments and how we still have, kind of a tap dance around authority. Certain things are legal in certain states, right? California, there are certain things that are now legal, right, involving green leafy plants that are not necessarily legal in other states. How is that possible? Can you be arrested then by a federal law enforcement? It's still kind of complicated. I don't smoke, so I don't necessarily pay too much attention to it, but those of you that do probably should, right? Because in certain states you can do certain things, but in other states you may not be able to. So think about this kind of delicate balance between states' rights and federal rights and all that we still are figuring out. It's going to lead us closer to war further into the 19th century. So Jackson threatens to send in the army, and it sort of shows how divided the nation has become sectionally, right? The different sections, North and South in particular. So that's issue number 2, the tariff. The third issue is the Bank of the United States. We're like, wait a second, we already talked about the Bank of the U.S., right? Talked about that under Hamilton yesterday. It comes up again. The second Bank of the United States comes up again under Jackson. Remember, the first one had been established under Washington's administration. Alexander Hamilton was insistent on it. Jackson viewed the bank as undemocratic. Remember, he gets elected as a representative of the common man. He views this as undemocratic and largely as a tool of northern commercial interests, northern bankers and such. So he kind of feels like, you know what, the bank is not a good thing. Let's get rid of it. So how is he going to get rid of it? In 1832, Andrew Jackson vetoes a bill that would have renewed the bank's charter. So he's like, okay, I'm going to make sure it dies slowly by not renewing it, right, in 1832. But in addition, it's not dying fast enough, so he decides, I'm going to kill it. It's not dying fast enough, so he decides to sort of kill it. He will remove the federal deposits from the bank. He'll remove the federal deposits from the bank, which leads to a confrontation between the president and the Congress. Ultimately, the Congress would censure him. They're going to sort of censure him for this, but it doesn't make it all the way through the House. So Jackson's victory over the bank, to some, was kind of a victory for democracy, right? The common man, the common person, even though it's going to cause a lot of economic problems, perhaps even like a minor depression, because he kills it. So by the end of 1837, the end of Jackson's second term, we firmly have a two-party system in place. Right? The two parties at the time are the Democrats, Jackson's party, and the Whigs. Right? The Democrats are at that point seen as the party of the common man. The Whigs would stand for, as they said, more orderly progress, kind of more elite, orderly progress. But what's interesting about this is we know that you can have two parties and still be American. Right? Both political parties feel like they're patriotic. Both political parties today, right, feel like they're patriotic, feel like they have the best interests of the nation in their mind and in their in view. And so this idea that you can have a loyal opposition is really important. Right? It's possible to be opposed to something but still be patriotic. And so we will maintain this kind of two-party system moving forward with, of course, some other, third-party alternatives, fourth-party alternatives, but two major parties moving forward. So keep this in mind, too, in terms of where we kind of arrive at politically and how we, and some of the parallels here. Right, our current president talked about Jackson as his hero. In some ways, I think he patterns himself, right, being an outsider to politics and saying and doing things that are seen as extreme or brash or whatever. So again, think about how history may inform some of these understandings in a wide variety of ways. Whether you agree or not, whether you support